Good morning, all. What a welcome we've had. It's not always that way. It's not always that we're welcomed in the workplaces where we try to make a difference. You don't belong, you don't fit in. How many of you have heard that? I've heard it many times in my life. You don't belong here because you're the wrong sex. You don't belong here because you're the wrong color. We use these behaviors, these words, we use sexual harassment, we use sexual violence, we use gendered violence to tell people they don't belong in our workplaces, to push them out. And we're very successful at doing that. I've seen many, many people pushed out of workplaces because they've been told, either verbally or physically, that they do not belong. When I first stepped on a mine site in Western Australia almost 20 years ago now, I didn't belong. I didn't come from a background that said you're going to go into mining. I'm not an engineer. You can put some rocks in front of me, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I drive a ute if that helps. But only because I think it makes me feel taller. And it's probably the cleanest ute in the Bunnings car park. I had a background in academia. I'd finished my PhD, I was working as an academic. If any of you working in the psychosocial space have some spare time, if you're not busy enough, look at academia for bullying and harassment. But I had an opportunity to go into mining. It was very unexpected. I had been spending the previous 4 years researching constructions of masculinity. I had been reading French feminist theory. This had nothing to do with mining whatsoever. So in a sense, I didn't belong. But I was also told constantly, and I saw people around me being told, again, either verbally or physically, this is not the place for you. There was a sense of entitlement among a certain cohort of people that this was their space, and that if you didn't fit in, if you weren't tough enough, that you didn't belong there. I had a problem with this right from the start, because I was going to Safe Start meetings where we were discussing safety topics, and then the supervisor or the manager would say, have a safe day. And I thought, how can people have a safe day when you are sending them out into a workplace where they are being bullied, harassed, because of their sex, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, because of their ethnicity? It doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me that I would be training a group of senior managers, and we're trying to discuss leadership techniques and workshop, and all they're interested in is asking me questions about my sexual behaviors. It didn't make sense to me that I was hearing from men who were devastated because of the bullying that they were experiencing, and that they could see that their young sons were starting to experience, who were also moving into the industry. So with my academic head still working, I asked a question. I asked, how can this be safe? Is there something going on in the way that we are behaving in this industry, in the mining industry in particular, that is making it an unsafe place for people, for everybody? And I started to have conversations with people, and it wasn't always bad. There were some great people that I was working with back then at the start. Some of those people are now leading some of the major mining companies, and it's great to see those people in those positions. I was very fortunate to meet people who also were asking the same question. Are we really doing the best we can to ensure that people are safe at work when we're allowing these behaviors to continue? And one of the groups of people that I spoke to and were listening was the Department of Mines and Petroleum. It was a safe work week on a mine site. I had a conversation with a couple of them from the department, and I was saying, I'm looking at this question. I'm exploring what is it about the construction, in particular, of the way that men behave in this industry that makes it unsafe. And they said, let's go around the state. Let's ask people. Let's do a roadshow to find out what other people think about this topic. I was very excited. So back in 2010, I don't know if any of you were around then, we went around Western Australia and we asked a question. Now, we had to phrase the question a little bit different to how I had imagined it. We had to remove the academic thinking. I couldn't talk to them. I couldn't be asking if people were interested in Simone de Beauvoir's construction of womanhood or Judith Halberstam's construction of female masculinity. That was a no-no. We were not in that space. We weren't even necessarily in a space where we could talk about masculinity or gender. So we framed it in a way to say, this toughness, this need to be strong in this workplace, in this industry, does it make you feel safe? How does it affect the safety of people on your mine sites? When all around us, everyone's telling us we need to toughen up, princess. Don't be a girl. Don't be gay. Be tougher. How is that affecting our safety? And we found in that roadshow back in 2010 that there was really not a lot of exposure to that thinking, the possibility that what it meant to be a good worker, what it meant to be in particular a male worker in the industry, was having a negative impact on people's safety in the workplace. That idea was not strong in people's mind. We found that there was a real culture of pushing out diversity. There was diversity. There were women working in the industry. There were gay and lesbian people working in the industry. There were trans people working in the industry back then. But there was an intense pressure through bullying, through harassment, through violence to push them out. What we also found at that time, in 2010, was people said, I don't want this anymore. This is not the workplace that I want. We spoke to 250 plus people around the state, workers in the industry, and consistently, wherever we went, people said, this is not how we want this industry anymore. Things have to change. Since 2010, I have had the opportunity to work in this space globally. I have worked with mining companies and oil and gas companies in Papua New Guinea, where we constructed an innovative approach to exploring women's safety in remote locations. I have worked with hydropower companies in Africa, where the rate of rape by the workers was so high that the local villages had created a word for babies born out of rape. I have worked for solar power, renewable energy projects, where there was a risk of the project losing its funding from its investors because of the rate of sexual harassment and sexual abuse that was going on in the workplace and in the local communities. And this wasn't a vague threat that they would lose that funding. There had already been an example just a year earlier where a project in Uganda had lost its international funding. The project had stopped because the business owners refused to address the issue. Through that journey, starting here in WA with the roadshow and through all of the experience that I've had over the last, how many years are we now? 13, 15 years plus. What I've been excited about is hearing more and more companies saying, we want to do something about this. We want to address this. We recognize that it's not nice to have these behaviors in our workplace. We recognize that it's not good for business. We're losing money because people are leaving or taking time off. But we also recognize that it creates an unsafe workplace. I've started to hear that more and more and been able to work with companies more and more. I had the fortune of going back to a company in Malawi earlier this year. I had worked with them first 3 years ago. They were in an awful state in terms of the harassment and violence on site. And I have seen the shift, the incredible shift, how they've managed to create a safe workplace for their workers by engaging with local expertise, by having conversations with workers, by making sure that their leadership were challenged to help change the culture. And then late last year, I got a call from Mind Safety, WorkSafe, saying, do you remember that roadshow we did back in 2010? Why don't we do it again? Why don't we see what's changed? And in my work, it's very rare that I get the opportunity to see what has changed. So I was extremely excited. And we discussed again what's going to be the approach. And our approach this time was to ask, okay, what are you doing? We know there's a problem. We've had big reports, public reports, that have told us what the problem is, not just in mining in Australia, but in many, many industries. We know there's a problem. I knew there was a problem decades ago. Let's see what companies are doing to respond to that problem. Let's find out where we are with the response. And so we went around Western Australia again, and people gave up their time to come to workshops and discuss with us, to tell us what the situation was for them now. Have things changed? I would say yes, they have. In the recent visits that I've had to mine sites, I feel the change. I don't feel that I have to try to be as tough as I used to be back then. I don't feel that I have to put on my armor to protect myself from what was then a lot of verbal and physical harassment. I talk to people, and people sense that there is something happening, that a change has happened. We're not there. We haven't eradicated these hazards. We haven't eradicated the instances of sexual harassment, gendered violence, verbal harassment, physical violence. It's still happening to an unacceptable level. But things are happening to help address that. In a diversity space, back in 2010, nobody was talking about transgender people. There were transgender people working in the industry, many of whom were trying to hide their gender identity, terrified that they would be found out. Nobody was really talking about the big differences between older and younger people and the risks that they might face, the different risks of bullying and harassment. Nobody was really talking openly about the presence of lesbian and gay workers in the industry. All of these different groups were discussed in the roadshow that we did in May this year. People are more willing to talk about difference. People are more willing to identify as being in categories of difference. There is a category missing here. And it was raised in a couple of the workshops. When people said, what about heterosexual white men? And I said, exactly. Heterosexual white men are part of the diversity. They are not outside of it. We are not saying that diversity and inclusion is about these types of people, but not heterosexual white men. I want to have conversations with heterosexual white men in the industry to understand how they are feeling, to understand what they are experiencing in terms of harassment and bullying. We need to have those conversations. They are part of the debate. What we found out in the roadshow, in terms of the different groups that we were looking at, we found out in particular that there is more acceptance and understanding of First Nations people in the industry, there is still a gap in the visibility, particularly at higher levels in the industry. We need a voice for First Nations people in the country, in the industry. Please let us have representation of Indigenous people on this stage next year. We found out that for older workers, there are growing fears around what is my role in the industry. Growing stress because they're not able to understand all the new technology or the rapid changes. We found out by talking to people on the roadshow, for women, what did we find out? I expected we would find out the situation had significantly changed, but unfortunately we found out not so. We found out that women are still being told, you're only employed because you're a woman, even though she has 30 years of experience. We found out that there is still a lack of facilities for women, which makes it very difficult for them to work in certain areas. We found out that there is still high risk of sexual harassment and violence against women, which makes it very difficult for them to work safely in remote locations. Persons with disabilities, we found out there is a greater acceptance of neurodifference, but not physical difference. We found out with immigrants that there is a greater acceptance of diverse cultures, but we're still hearing a lot of bullying around the things that people eat and the way that they talk. It sometimes reminds me of going back to primary school. So there have been shifts in diversity, but not as far as we need to go. One positive, remember back when I said in 2010, we had to talk about toughness because we didn't have the language. One positive we found is that the language is there and growing. People understand now what is sexual harassment. People understand what is bullying. People understand there's still a little bit of confusion between trans identity and sexual orientation. People are still confusing trans people with gay and lesbian people, but they're talking about trans issues. They're talking about sexual orientation. The language is there. This is an incredible achievement over the last 13 years, particularly in the mining industry here in Western Australia, to have created this language where we can now have conversations about things that we would never have been able to have 13 years ago. We wanted to find out, what are your companies, what are your employers doing to prevent psychosocial harm? What are they doing to prevent incidents of harassment, bullying, violence, gendered violence? And many of them said, we have policies. You can go into our systems and you can read our policies. They're all there, locked away. Policies that AI could have written. Policies that were not written by engaging the workers and saying, for example, look, we need to create a code of conduct around behaviours. What are the kind of behaviours that you're seeing that you don't like? What are the kind of behaviours that you would like your leaders to exhibit? None of that going on. People were saying the code of conduct is coming down from HR. This is the way you will now behave. So the policies, the paperwork looks good in theory, but there's not a lot of engagement in order to create those policies and procedures. There's not a lot of reflection on those policies after a certain amount of time to see if they're being implemented well or they need updating. So we've got the paper, we just don't have the practice. Training. We found that most people are now being exposed to some training around psychosocial risks. Whether it's training on sexual harassment and what it is, or whether it's training on the code of conduct and what you can and cannot do, that most people out of the representatives on the roadshow saying in their company there is some training that is addressing psychosocial risks. What we found, however, about that training is that it's often a piecemeal training. There's no overarching plan that says we're doing that training because it will meet these particular aims in terms of the prevention of psychosocial harm, and we will measure it. We've just got a training program here, or we've got a training program over there. That the companies are not necessarily bringing it all together to measure. We found that there's a real popular piece of training right now called bystander training. It seems to be like the fad at the moment. Let's do bystander training. Now, bystander training is very impactful. It can teach people tools to intervene, deflect, that they may not have had before, but it is not the solution to psychosocial hazards. It is part of it. And we have to consider and be very wary, I think, in this space of the impacts of this training. Just in the last month, I have had several people come up to me and say, I've had bystander training, and then I saw this happen, or I heard this happen at work, and I didn't speak out, and I feel really, really guilty. Because bystander training told me that I have to be strong enough, tough enough to speak out. We're creating a new version of toughness in the industry that says you must speak out when you see these behaviors happening. No. If you don't feel safe at the time, if you don't feel comfortable, you have every right not to speak out. That is your choice. So we need to be very careful with bystander training that it is about some tools that you may be able to use. And it doesn't mean that person then has an absolute responsibility to speak out every time they see negative behaviors occurring. There have been many times when I have seen behaviors occurring that I do not like, but I have not spoken out because I do not feel safe at the time to do so. One of the big gaps I think that we have in training is training that allows people, workers, to have open conversations about these behaviors. Not just to understand what sexual harassment is, but to be able to say, I don't get it. I don't understand why I'm allowed to say something to you, and when I say it to somebody else, they get offended and it's suddenly sexual harassment. I don't understand the change. I'm confused. There's not a lot of that conversation going on that allows a more team-focused discussion, grassroots discussion around what are we talking about and how can we, at a grassroots level, work together to address the issue. Leaders. What did they say about leaders? They said, in general, our leaders are supportive of the work around psychosocial risk management. Our leaders are supportive of rollout of sexual harassment training, etc. Our leaders are not attending that training. Our leaders are not doing their work of thinking, hang on, what are we doing that's also creating a culture or an environment in which bullying, sexual harassment is allowed to occur? What are we doing with the behaviors that we exhibit in our own meeting rooms? That the leaders are often stepping outside of it and saying, this is a worker's problem. Here's your code of conduct. You now need to behave differently. Here's your training. Now you know how to behave differently. Stop being bad people. Leaders are part of the problem. We are all part of the problem. Very few people go to work planning to be a bad person. They go to work and the situation, the environment, the stress, the pressure, what's going on around them, encourages them to act in certain ways that cause harm to other people. Leaders are part of that practice, not just the solution. We often hear that change begins at the top. I want leaders involved with wherever the people are at the bottom. I want them doing the same work. I want them questioning their own behaviors and their own attitudes, not telling workers it's time that you change because up till now you haven't been behaving well. We found that there is not a lot, there's some, but not a lot of prevention learning going on. An incident happens. Sexual harassment, for example, is reported, investigated, decision is made about whether it happened or not, disciplinary action is taken. That's it. That case is then locked away. We're not seeing a lot of, hang on, what is it that allowed that to happen? What can we put in place now? What can we put in place to prevent this incident from happening again, or this type of incident? What is it we need to do to create a more conducive environment for the good behaviors rather than the behavior, this individual behavior that we've just seen? The reason for this, I think, is because we're still focused on these behaviors, gendered violence, sexual harassment. We're still focused on them as things that a few bad people do. And if we can just get rid of those few bad people, everything will be okay. If we sacked every single person who had ever engaged in some kind of verbal harassment, sexual abuse, whatever, if we sacked every single person, the majority of us in this room would be without a job. We've all done it at some point. It is part of our culture. It is part of our culture to understand men are better than women. White people are better than black people. We bring this into the workplace. We all have the potential to act this way. Most people don't want to. When you point it out to people, most people can change. They will recognize and be willing to learn to act differently. We are not giving them a chance because we're focusing on bad people and individual cases, when we need to be looking more at what does that case, what does that incident tell us about the kind of workplace that we have, and what controls can we put in place to change that workplace. We're also seeing that there are still some topics we're not comfortable talking about in this space. We can talk about sexual harassment. We can talk about discrimination against women. We can talk about inclusion and diversity. One of the topics that we don't seem to be talking about in industry, in particular in male-dominated industries like mining, is violence against men, including sexual violence against men. We don't seem to be able to talk about it, but I'm thinking this is the time. We are now in a position, we've done the work, we've got the language, it's time to start looking at this issue too, because it is a significant issue, particularly in an industry like mining. We're also not talking so much about the real root causes of these behaviors. We kind of think we've got root causes. We say, oh, it's alcohol and drugs the root cause. Alcohol and drugs are not a root cause. They're a contributing factor. The root causes are the really embedded attitudes, gender inequality, racial inequality. We're not really doing a lot of work in the workplace to understand how is gender inequality being played out here? How is racial inequality being played out here? So that we can address the root causes of the behaviors that cause harm to Indigenous people, to women, etc. The next thing, or the second thing that we asked them about, we wanted to find out, okay, you've done the prevention, we can see there's some work going on, there's some gaps. What about when an incident occurs? What are you doing? And we found out that there are some significant gaps in the reporting channels that companies have set up. So most companies have a reporting channel, one or two. If I experience bullying, if I experience gendered violence, I can report it in one way or another. But we found that there's a real pressure from companies to not report anonymously. They kind of say, oh, here's the anonymous reporting channel, but that's not the main one. There's another one where you tell us who you are, who the person is, and we get all of those details so that we can then do the investigation to find out who the bad person is and get rid of them. It follows through. But we know that particularly for gendered violence and harassment, these behaviors that cause significant psychosocial harm, that when people experience them, it's very difficult to report. There's a sense of shame, there's a sense of blame. What did I do wrong? If I tell anybody, who else will they tell? I'm more likely to report and let you know as a company if I can report anonymously. And then you can still, as a company, say, okay, we don't know the details of this specific incident, but we can look at why this kind of behavior might be occurring in our workplace. And we can look at controls that we can put in place to manage the hazards. We also found that there is a high risk of somebody, if they report, of having a negative experience. This is not unique to workplaces or industry. It's unfortunately the experience, negative experiences are common when people report to the police about sexual violence. The legal system is a very, very harsh place for anybody seeking support after experiencing sexual violence. In mining industries in particular, we're seeing that there is a high risk that if I report an incident, the response that I get will be negative. And the reason for this is because there are unsafe responses. And by that I mean responses that are taken, decisions that are taken that are not the decision I necessarily want as the person who's been affected. I report and tell you that my supervisor is bullying me. Okay, we're going to move you to another work site, as if I've done something wrong. Or we're going to now do a full investigation. I don't want an investigation. No, we have to do an investigation. We have to find out whether it's true or not. I don't want an investigation. I just want to talk to somebody about what's happened to me. I just want to have some support at this point. No. So these unsafe decisions going down the investigation track immediately are happening quite commonly. And we also have inadequate training for the people that are on the receiving end of the reports. There is often an assumption that if you're working in HR and if you're a woman working in HR, you know how to deal with these issues. No. You need specialized training. You need to understand, how do I respond in a way that can support somebody once they have experienced this? If they're going to disclose an incident to me, how can I respond in a way that is supportive and is not going to do additional harm to them? They need that training. If a company is putting you in a role where you are the contact person for anybody in the workplace to tell you that they've experienced bullying or harassment, if that's the role that you've been given, the company, your employer, has a responsibility to provide you with access to training so that you can do that role safely for yourself and safely for the people that are talking to you. So, we did a roadshow in 2010 at a time when I knew there was a problem, many people knew there was a problem. We didn't have the language. We just wanted to find out, do you have a problem with this? Do you see that Toughness is making for an unsafe workplace? Overwhelmingly, yes, we want to change. We came back this year, asked similar questions. Have attitudes changed? Has the industry moved away from this idea that the only fit is this hyper-masculine person who drives the ute, the dirty ute? Is this no longer an industry in which I need to be a particular person to fit in? That we can start to accept that there are different ways of living, different ways of experiencing the world, different ways of working, and we can still get the job done. Is that the industry that we're now seeing? I'd say yes, partially, inconclusively. We still have a long way to go. There are still too many incidents occurring. There is still a lot of work to do to understand how do we deal with these gendered behaviors, this gendered violence, this sexual harassment in a way that enables us to learn and progress, moving away from seeing it as an individual's problem. We still have a long way to go on that. However, I'm proud to have been with an industry for 15 plus years that is making the step, that is taking steps to address what are otherwise, for many people in this room, as Chrissy asked you to identify, who have experienced harm in the workplace that none of us want. So I encourage you, for those of you that are working in this space, and I know I've met some wonderful people over the last couple of months again who are doing great work. There's a lot of good work going on. I encourage you in your businesses, in your companies, to continue to keep asking the questions. What is it we can do better? How much more can we learn so that we can progress, that we can do better at preventing these incidents from happening, and that when they do, we can provide much better support to the people who have been affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Amazing. I'm going to hand you the mic here because we have got a bunch of questions that have come through. And thank you to those who have submitted questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. As I say, the QR codes are on your tables if you want to jump in there and throw a last-minute question in. I might start with this one just because it's something you touched on just towards the back end of your presentation there. This goes to the question of whether or not to investigate, I think. How does a company reconcile their accountability to address an incident with the victim's choice, re safe and unsafe responses?
I think if you pose that question to different people, you'll get a different answer depending on whether they're coming from a legal perspective or a trauma-informed perspective. It's not that you cannot investigate individual incidents. You can. What is important is that you have the consent of the person who's been affected. That is primary. There are certain instances where that gets overridden. If it's a criminal issue, for example, if the person is potentially at risk of significant future harm. But in general, you need the consent of that person to investigate and go further. But that investigation is all about seeking an outcome for that individual person, which is extremely important. Within that needs to be support, access to support that I can't provide, that HR people probably can't provide. The counselling, long-term counselling, for example. That needs to be there if you're going to do that investigation. There needs to be support, I would argue too, for alleged perpetrators and proven perpetrators. We're missing that piece of work as well. But that is a different kind of investigation that you do when you're looking at it from a safety perspective. And the safety perspective is as important in order for organizations to learn from the incident that's occurred, to learn what is it that we didn't have in place, that we could put in place to prevent this from happening again.
Thank you. We're in similar territory here. Have you seen any best practice regarding internal reporting and investigation process of psychosocial hazards and incidents?
I think the good practice I've seen, I think there are still, as I said, gaps in training, particularly for HR people, around how do I do this kind of investigation. But where I see good practice is where companies are setting up a line of communication between HR and safety around, okay, this incident is probably going to come into HR as a first point, but we need to get safety involved, and where they've set up procedures and templates and forms to ensure that safety gets as much information as it needs to do the safety investigation, the controls investigation, but doesn't do it in a way that risks the confidentiality or the privacy of the people involved. Because safety doesn't necessarily need to know the people that are involved. They're looking at the controls around the behavior. When they have that line of communication, when they have that procedure in place, that's where I see good practice.
Thank you. Are organisations exposed to complaints concerning the duty to reasonably accommodate persons with mental disabilities, depression or anxiety-related disorders?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Are organisations exposed to complaints concerning the duty to reasonably accommodate persons with mental disabilities, depression or anxiety-related disorders?
I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question. Is it complaints because of not employing or complaints of...
concerning their duty to reasonably accommodate. So I suppose, being welcoming and inclusive of people who might exhibit a mental disability, depression or anxiety-related disorder. That's my interpretation anyway.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that I'm understanding the question, or maybe I'm not the right person to answer this question, but I don't think... It seems to me that the question is coming from a point of view of, well, if we do this, are we going to be more exposed to complaints? And I don't think that's the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what is it that these people can offer to our organisation, and what do we need to do to support them to be productive and safe within the organisation?
Okay. Let's get back into this idea of whether or not to investigate or how to go about it. Sorry, the questions just jumped around in front of me. Any best practice in supporting people who don't want an investigation? This person says, my experience is fear by PCBUs in not investigating, for example, legislation or insurance breach.
So on the legislation and insurance side, I will leave that to my colleagues on the table to answer. But I think it's interesting that all the questions are coming in around investigation as well. We tend to be more focused on this than we do the prevention side. Good practice investigations, if you don't want to go ahead with investigation, is providing good support to the people that have been affected. That's often what they want. They want someone to talk to. They maybe want to, whether it's internal or external, just to share the experience. They want somebody to maybe to go and talk to the person on their behalf, to say, look, this is unacceptable behaviour. Can we just not do this anymore? And once the behaviour stops, I'm fine. It's not always. Once the affected person understands the risks of an investigation and the complexity of an investigation, they may usually, in my experience, opt for something else, which is a support. So it's about having good support systems in place, which does not just mean saying go and call the EAP and wait 6 weeks until you can talk to somebody. It also means having people internally who are trained to be able to provide psychosocial first aid, which is not full counselling, but that I can listen to you, I can understand, I can provide that immediate support.
Thank you. From Stephen Best, who asks, is eradication the goal and is it achievable? If eradication is not practical, then what is the acceptable level, and is this level dictated by society?
Is Stephen here, or is he asking this from away? Oh, thank you, Steve. Okay. So no, I don't think eradication is possible in my lifetime. The root causes of these behaviours, which I've mentioned, gender inequality and power dynamics around different sexual orientations and racial inequality, I'm not going to see those in the end of my lifetime. So I don't see that organisations can move towards eradication. If any of your organisations are claiming now they have best practice and we've eradicated it, I'm sorry, you haven't. Like, they're lying. We've got to move towards better practice, keep learning, keep exploring. Even those of us that have been in this space for 20 plus years are still learning every day around what works in different workplaces and what doesn't. So it's about moving, it's about putting in the controls that work for your workplace or individual teams that will help to reduce the risk of exposure to these incidents. And like any other safety risk, being prepared to respond in a safe way if an incident occurs. I think if we move towards eradication and we believe that we've eradicated it, there's no need for those response systems to be in place. We need those response systems to be strengthened.
Does that answer your question, Stephen? Any follow-up?
No,
no follow-up.
Thank you, Steve.
We'll have a tea break soon anyway. If you think of anything, track Dean down. I'm sure he'd be happy to continue that chat. You spoke a lot about your 2010 roadshow, so this question is about that and wants to know, were any participants in that 2010 roadshow also in the more recent one, and did their personal reflections match your observations of the cultural shift that you observed?
Did you say were the participants the same as well?
Yeah, were any of the participants in the 2010 one also in the recent one, and did they notice the same things that you noticed?
Yeah, I don't know. There are a couple of people that came up to me and said I was in the 2010, but in general I would say the participants were different cohort. Younger cohort, these are the ones that are now saying, I'm trans and I work in the industry, and I'm gay and lesbian and I work in the industry, and it's like, whoa, we didn't get this in 2010. This is great. I think that, yes, people are sharing their personal experiences, people are reflecting on what they have experienced, but people are also starting better to understand this is not just an individual problem, this is something they want to work with their company at a systems level to address. And I think that is a significant shift from the 2010, when we were kind of still looking at bad men, was the kind of debate around it a lot of times in the roadshow in 2010. People were talking about the bad men and the ones that they didn't want in the workplace anymore. We're now looking more at, okay, maybe there are still some around, some bad people, but in general, it's the environment that we need to address.
Okay, thank you. This anonymous submission says tokenism exists in most industries, and there's no engagement with lived experience to develop frameworks and policy. How can organisations utilise lived experience?
Whoa. Okay. Well, tokenism does exist. I mean, of course it does. People have their quotas, and we know this happens. It's not fair to put that on the individuals that have been employed, though, and assume that they are part of the tokenism. I think lived experience, from what I got from the roadshow participants, is that lived experience is having an impact on the way that their employers are responding. So they are recognizing that there are different flexible work arrangements for different people because of their different lives, different lived experiences, that there are different ways of working because of neurodiversity, that this is the we don't know the extent to which this is happening, but certainly people are saying that their employers are starting to think about those things. Mm.
How do you convince an executive team of 4 middle-aged white men? This is not my question, by the way. How do you convince an executive team of 4 middle-aged white men that this is an important topic?
Okay. It's the same way.
You've got almost 10 minutes on this one, Dean, if you like.
It's the same way that you convince, I think, workers, 4 middle-aged or young white male workers. You have a conversation with them around the topic. You don't go in and say, right, executives, this is what we're going to do now. These are the behaviours that you need to exhibit, and this is what you can't. You've got to have a discussion with them around how is it we've been working so far, and how are we expected to work? Is this really creating a safe space for our company? There is another hook at the executive level, though, which is the business case. It's the dollars. And there is so much research out there now that says this is scientific methodologies that prove diversity is good for business in terms of productivity and profit. And exactly the same with when you have safe workplaces, when you have workplaces in which people feel mentally healthy. There is significant research, there's a lot of research now coming out that shows, company by company, that this is good for business. So if the let's be nice angle doesn't work, then you can use the other hook is the business case and say, look, this is bad for business if we keep on this way. It's costing us money. And I've done that. I don't care how I hook them in. Like if they don't want to be nice, but they're going to see the dollars, fine, I've got you there, then we can do the work.
I think this is one of my own questions here. I'm going to own this question. A lot of the behaviours and attitudes that you're talking about, I think myself, they started to take shape in the people around me back in school days, even the early years of school. And yet all the onus in the conversation now seems to be focused on workplace and the organisations who employ people. Are we expecting too much of companies and organisations to reset and reshape those deeply embedded attitudes when the conversation should be much broader?
No, I don't think we're expecting too much of companies at all. I think you have a responsibility to provide a safe workplace and a happy workplace. Then you'll get more productive employees. I mean, that's not too much to ask at all. It may feel like too much because we still don't know. There's no kind of checklist, do these 10 things and it'll work. It's a little bit more complicated than that. You've got to do the thinking, look at the environment. You've got to do the work. So it might feel like too much, but I don't think it is too much. This conversation is going on in other places outside as well. I mean, the conversation in schools, for example, one of the most difficult and kind of depressing conversations at the moment the teachers are having to grapple with, particularly among teenage boys, is the growth in misogyny because of social media personalities. It's having a major impact on young boys in schools that is kind of twisting them the other way to believe that they have ownership of women and so on. And so that conversation is going on. The work is being done in schools. And I think in society as well, we're arguably seeing a little bit of a backlash right now with the progress that has been made around equality for women and equality for lesbian and gay people, particularly in this country. I think the voice debate is an example of where that backlash is being seen and seen in very awful ways as well. But yeah, I don't think it's just a workplace, which is why we're saying you can't eradicate. We're not saying this is a workplace created problem, but we're saying that the company, the business has a responsibility to minimize the risk of this happening and deal with harm if it happens at the workplace.
I think back to an anonymous question from the audience, not one of mine, but on this topic, I think this person asks, does the work need to start earlier, i.e. in kindergarten?
Well, yes, but I think it is. But I think we're not here looking at psychosocial hazards in kindergartens or in schools. We're here looking at psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So I think that work is going on. It's outside of the work that I do. I'm worried that it's a little bit of a blame again, or a kind of a passing of it's your responsibility, that we can't solve it. We're not asking, there's no expectation that we're going to solve this, that it's going to end. There is an expectation that we work together to create healthier, happier workplaces. I don't want to go to work and be bullied anymore. I don't want to go to a mine site and be pushed up against a wall and told that I don't belong here. I don't want to go to a mine site and see a man crying because he's so devastated by the bullying that he's experienced by his teammates. That's not right. It's not fair. It has long-term harm impacts on people. So we have a responsibility to just do something, keep working to make sure that the workplaces are safer and happier. And Chrissy has said she wants it faster. It's more urgent, and I think she's absolutely right. This is not something that we can just say, we'll deal with it at some point. No, it's having major impact on people and on businesses right now. It's something we need to deal with now.
This might be our final one. With your experience with mine safety, Dean, are they doing enough?
Ooh.
Let's wrap it up on a doozy for a few people in the room.
Did that one come from Stephen again? I've had the pleasure of working with the mine safety team over the last couple of months and getting to know them and getting to know the work that they're doing. They work in a different space than I do. They work under the legislation. I don't, so I can say things that maybe don't agree with the legislation. I think they do an incredible job. I think there is an enormous amount of expertise in the mental health and wellbeing team, and Chrissy named those people. I'm not necessarily convinced that that expertise is being utilised to the best that it could be to help industry, and that's a debate that I know that we've discussed many times. I think there is, it's difficult because they're on the compliance side, while at the same time they have this enormous amount of expertise that could be so helpful to industry in terms of education and information. That's not a position that I have to juggle because I'm not on the compliance side. I'm very happy to continue working with them, and I've learnt a lot from them. Stephen might be an exception after the questions he's given. But
So was that a yes or a no?
That's a definite yes. I mean, they're doing an incredible job, and if you have any questions around, how your workplace what it can do in terms of meeting legislation requirements, but also outside of that, just creating healthier workplaces, they're the people to go to. Talk to them. They have a wealth of experience.
Fantastic. Dean, thank you so much for your presentation and for being so generous with your answers as well. And thank you again to those who submitted questions. Would you please thank Dean Laplonge?
Thank you.
Thank you.